I'm very pleased to be here for another special conversation, this time with my friend, colleague, and former classmate, Matt Flamm. Matt is, among many other things, a specialist in the thought, the life, and the works of Georges Santayana, very active in the Santayana Society. And you've got some works on him too, right, as well. So maybe we'll talk about that. But, Santayana is a philosopher who I don't think is very well known, so I wanted to take the opportunity while I have somebody here who really does know him to make the case why he might be interesting to you, the viewers, and why he's worth reading, mulling over, studying, why there could be, in fact, a Santayana Society, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. So one place to begin is, people probably have not read Santayana. Where should they start if they're going to pick one work or essay to begin with?
And those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it is the most famous quote of Santayana's that is passed along, and very few people who use that quote or paraphrase it know that it's even Santayana, and that's fine. That's true of a lot of thinkers, but that particular quote comes from an early philosophical sort of series that he wrote, that for which he became first most famous, called The Life of Reason. And we talk about this elsewhere. Jumping off points for a figure like Santayana are difficult because it really depends on where you're coming from. And for me, it was skepticism and animal faith.
That was the first one for me as well.
Yeah.
Which I only happened to read because I picked it up at a used bookstore and I'd heard Santayana was somebody to check out from being at SIU.
Yeah. And honestly, biographically, towards my sort of philosophical development, Santayana was the reason I got into philosophy. I was a young undergraduate student. I took my first philosophy, my second philosophy class at that time, and I'd read Descartes' Meditations, and I'd read some other things, and I was really sort of fired up about this stuff about which I was only starting to become aware. Yeah. And then I read that text, and there was something about it, it just made sense to me. He was re-engaging Cartesianism, and if anyone who's read Skepticism and Animal Faith, that's an introduction to his ontological realms of being, the larger work that he wrote in his later second half of his publishing life. But the book is in itself a really rich engagement with the Cartesian sort of approach, and he intends it as a kind of subversion of it ultimately, But it just was so powerful to me, and it said, for me, in the young stage of my reading of Descartes, I remember thinking exactly the thoughts of, this is what problem I had with Descartes too. That's the sort of the thought I had when I read Skepticism. Now, that then, of course, led to having to, engage with all kinds of things, because Santayana, as a thinker, and this is one of the things that makes him so unique, he kind of requires you to engage with the whole history of philosophy. I mean, Santayana is rooted in Platonism, a big part of his thinking. He was a great, great student of Plato. He studied under Paulson in Germany, who was a great scholar, teacher of Plato. So he knew his Plato, he knew his Aristotle very well, and from that basis then provides, and he also engaged with the moderns in a very, very deep way. So very broad-minded, philosophical upbringing himself that then led to a very original philosophic outlook of his own. He's a materialist, which is not a very popular word, and it has weird connotations. And
there's varieties of materialists depending on what you consider matter to consist in.
Yeah. And if it makes sense to philosophical listeners, I would characterize him as a non-reductive materialist, meaning he's really trying to reconcile what we think of the spiritual life with our material existence, and that's maybe a straightforward way of thinking about what he's really about. Santayana believes there is something like a spiritual life, and he thinks it is synonymous with whatever we are in terms of our consciousness.
Yeah, so, this is a bit of a digression. Maybe we'll come back to more recommendations in a bit, but is that why, although not religious himself, he takes religion seriously, looking at it almost in a continuity with the aesthetic and other higher drives of the human being?
Most certainly, yeah. And having been raised Catholic, although his his father and mother differed in their own religious alliances significantly, and as many, I think, people who come from religious upbringings, that's very often the case.
Yeah,
their parents will
mixed
have
marriages, they call them.
Yeah, and but that surely had a formative influence on him. But Santayana, as a young person, was very, very idealistic and very religiously inclined, almost to a point where, I mean, early on he may have been destined for the priesthood even.
Yeah.
But he eventually just migrated towards this life of this intellectual life. He also had early aspirations to be an architect, which is just a side footnote. Shows that how aesthetically inclined he was as well. And but he, to this point, he's eclectic. His relation to religion is very sort of like interesting. He wrote voluminously. I mean, he has a book called Platonism and the Spiritual Life, which is a beautiful appreciation of the spiritual life in connection with the tradition of Platonism, and then another book called The Idea of Christ in the Gospels, which shows an unbelievable literacy in the history of Christian religion and an appreciation for its contributions to culture. So Santayana saw it in a kind of a cultural way. He sees a religion as a kind of vital source of sustenance in a cultural way, I think.
I mean, do you think that's similar with Royce then?
Yeah.
He was connected with, right?
Yeah. His teacher at Harvard, no question, I think that Santayana probably imbibed something of this from Royce directly, although another thing that needs to be written by somebody smarter than me. I wish somebody like Randy Ogsher would think about this, because he's so versed in Royce and only a little bit touched on Santayana. I think he's suspicious of him, and understandably. But I'd love to see somebody like Randy comment on that relationship, and then also talk about the contrast, because Royce famously had the prophecy of Santayana, and Santayana relates this in the LP volume on his thought. He says that it was Royce who first had the kind of his finger on what my philosophy was really about at the earliest stages of my being a student under Royce. He did his dissertation under Royce. He said that it sounds like what's fundamental to your philosophy is the separation between essence and existence, and sort of intimidating categories, but they become categories in his ontological system. But Santayana says that because at that time, when he was a student under Royce, he wanted to write on Schopenhauer. And he said, well, that would be okay, but it's not appropriate for a proper dissertation. So why don't you write on Lotze, Herman Lotze? My German pronunciation is terrible. But and he wrote a fine dissertation on that, and Royce, of course, was satisfied with it. But it's an interesting moment because you could tell that this has it's kind of the DNA of Santayana's early development. You can tell that Royce had a big impact on his early formative development, for sure.
It's also kind of funny because, I mean, who read Lutze today compared to Schopenhauer?
Right, I know, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's just graduate school kind of stuff. I mean, we had our own versions of it at our graduate school, too.
Yeah.
Right? So now I wrote on Santayana in my graduate school for my prelim exam, as we talk about in another discussion, but... so he's an eclectic figure. He's known but not known. Kind of.
Well, let's talk about where he fits in American philosophy. And I think a lot of viewers don't really know this because they look at the current academic configuration where American philosophy, and when we're talking about the continent, is really dominated by analytic philosophy. But that's something that developed in the 1950s onward, and almost sort of a cultural imperialism took place, in terms of that style. But before that, there was something that we call classical American philosophy, reaching all the way back to, people like Jonathan Edwards and the Transcendentalists, and then reaching forward to people like John Dewey. Where does Santayana fit into that? I mean, he's an outsider in a way, but he's also clearly in the stream of American philosophy, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the tradition of naturalism, among the isms we associate with American philosophy, of course, the first most is pragmatism, but thanks to Dewey and James and so on. Mm-hmm. But naturalism is a broader kind of tradition, if we can call it that, within the classical American philosophic tradition. He belongs square in that, and in fact. So there was a volume put out in, I should know the decade, but I don't offhand, but there was a volume on critical realism that came out that had Santayana featured in there, and it was against his own wishes to be in there. He he was invited, and he said, "Oh, sure, whatever."
Who put that up? Do you know?
Gosh, why am I forgetting off the top? Because I'm being asked to remember. That's why. But give me a second. And
Sure.
So, but he was included in the volume, and but the reason he objected to it was this term realism, right? He saw the affinities, and he certainly understood why so-called critical realists were convinced that somebody like Santayana would be among their number or whatever.
Yeah.
Santayana, as a self-professed materialist, he believed that existence, in the realm of existence, as he later called it, I guess, is the only it's the source and cause of all there is, and he thinks that he's not Plato, as I said a moment ago. He's friendly to Plato. He's not a transcendental thinker himself. He believes that he's closer, as a matter of fact, to the ancient Stoics, perhaps.
Yeah, thinking that spiritual reality is in some way material.
Yep.
There have been other people along the way as well who adopted. I mean, we can think of Hegel as somebody like that.
There's some interesting, connections between Santayana and Hegel. His early Life of Reason series, he thought it was tainted with Hegelianism, which is, I think, an overstatement. He just, in his own mind, I think he thought he was too influenced by Hegel. But it's got
Nietzsche had the same criticism of his, Birth of Tragedy as well. Right?
Yeah.
I suppose if you're gonna pick somebody to be contaminated by, Hegel would, not be a bad guy.
Yeah. So Santayana, I think that, to your kind of earlier part of your question, so the American tradition in the classical sense, we think of C.S. Peirce and as a kind of a bookending figure, but going back before Peirce, certainly Jonathan Edwards, Emerson, Thoreau, and so on. But Peirce is kind of the beginning of a particular strain in American philosophy, and it becomes pragmatism. It becomes the most sort of world-recognized way of thinking about American philosophy.
For a lot of people, probably the only thing that they associate with American philosophy.
Exactly,
right?
especially Europeans. You talk to the average person, if they know anything about American philosophy, they say, "Oh yeah, pragmatism, John Dewey and James and Peirce," they might know, but Santayana not so much. And in fact, when you see the collections of American philosophy, he's not always included. He sometimes is, mostly is. If it's a classical,
I think it depends mostly on how comprehensive the collection is going to be. If it's going to be something that's almost like just a textbook for maybe non-majors, it probably won't happen.
Yep. And he himself nonetheless insisted on being categorized as an American philosopher. He was intellectually bred, certainly in America. He wrote in English not only because he mastered it, but even as Bertrand Russell, of all people, who complimented and said, he's the greatest writer in English in the American tradition. Somebody like Bertrand Russell complimenting him for his English writing shows why he never really strayed from that. He was obviously an artistically inclined person to begin with, and already had a poetic sensibility.
Yeah.
So I think his facility with language and his transition to English was kind of seamless. And then he never strayed from that. And moreover, I think he would have said in his more honest moments, I think he would have admitted that he really never he formed his central philosophic positions out of the American sensibility and the American tradition. I think he would admit that. He doesn't directly admit that in any of his writings. He comes close to admitting it, but I think in his more honest moments, he would have to confess that. I mean, he was, again, he's a student of James and Royce.
In a certain sense, to be part of the American tradition already means to have these other connections to Britain and to European culture. You mentioned that he does, he's not just reading German philosophy, which I think everybody in American philosophy was doing at the time, but he studied there. And there's a lot of confluences. I know James more a bit in this respect, mostly actually from his connection with French writers who he was corresponding with. So I imagine there must have been something quite similar with Santayana.
Absolutely. There's actually at SIU, our PhD institution, they had at one time, and I'm not sure they still do, but they had in their special collections, they had Santayana's copy of William James's Principles of Psychology.
Oh, wow.
Which James was reading in manuscript for the courses Santayana was taking with James. So imagine that, taking William James's, whatever the title of the course was, and he's reading from his manuscript, Principles of Psychology. Well, years later, Santayana, when he left America, in fact, he bequeathed his book. I should know who offhand. I did it one time, and I'll think of that again, but I'm not trying to. But the book ended up becoming, he just sort of said, who wants this? And it was bequeathed, and eventually ended up at Carbondale. But it was, I looked at it, and it's his copy of the Principles of Psychology with all kinds of
Annotations?
and fascinating. And
Yeah,
there's, he, in one moment he writes essence in the margins next to a passage of James. So he's clearly influenced by James. There's no question.
Yeah.
And I would say this. I would say his understanding of psychology is almost directly. I mean, it's absolutely connected with William James's thinking, and his understanding of psychology and human behavior and the way he discusses it in various contexts is absolutely.
Well, I mean, James has in common, and so does Royce, that you brought up sort of non-reductive materialism. Mm-hmm. This notion, James, faulted the empiricists for not being empirical enough, for not attending to enough of a range of human experiences, and wanting to say, well, if it can't be measured, taking what we nowadays would call a scientific way, but back in the day they called positivism, taking a positivist attitude towards it. So I think that, do you see that as something that's essential to American philosophy, or is that something that kind of falls out of the picture maybe with Dewey and onward?
This kind of radical empiricism, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a good, that's the way James described it, and I think that's a good rubric for all of it. Yeah. Empiricism that thinks that, Lockean empiricism or Humean empiricism or the empiricism of a positivist Spencer, or if they were looking at Russell, is not cutting it, because it leaves out too wide of a swath of our actual experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So Santayana. The only difference is Santayana would say, why not nature? Why not matter? I think his problem with both James and Dewey ultimately is he saw them as squinting in their own ways, and maybe that to some extent that was unfair, but he has specific essays in which he engages them pretty deeply, and the exchange. I don't know if I mentioned it in the previous discussion, but the famous confrontation between John Dewey and Georges Santayana happened in 1925, I believe, in the Journal of Philosophy, and Santayana famously accused Dewey of being a half-hearted naturalist, and then Dewey responded by calling him a broken-back naturalist. So it's this kind of like talking past.
What do those mean? What do they mean by those?
Boy, that's
complaints.
There's been some things written on it. I've tried to write on it myself. I think Richard Rubin has one of the best commentaries on it, if you want to look him up. But what does it mean? So Santayana, I see it as a lost opportunity first and foremost, just to speak biographically.
Oh, interesting.
I've always thought. John Dewey was far more charitable, for sure, and gracious and open to having a kind of a connection with Santayana. Santayana just preempted that by just kind of basically pissing Dewey off, from the very beginning. But with that particular essay, in fact, which he insisted on, as Larry Hickman pointed out to me a couple of times, Santayana insisted on having that go for his further comment, that he had a chance to actually amend that for a later publication. Said, do you want to add to this after Dewey had his response? No, just let that go. I don't care. And he even says in a letter don't bother. So he didn't make much effort. Let's just say Santayana didn't to make connections with Dewey, which is very unfortunate. I would argue that Experience in Nature by John Dewey has a lot more in common with skepticism and animal faith than either of those thinkers would care to admit. Maybe Dewey more than Santayana would care to admit.
It's interesting. So that brings to mind for me two other sort of missed opportunities. One also from the 20th century, stemming from the Christian philosophy debates that I do work on that took place in France, and same sort of thing where you've got this Blondelian position coming from Maurice Blondel, and you've got Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain lined up against them, and for three Catholic thinkers who, in the rest of their dealings with everybody else, treated other people with the utmost of charity, not just in the sense of in an academic way, but in showing the virtue of it. Yeah. It's almost as if they deliberately misunderstood each other's position so that there could be a conflict, because there were so many ways in which what they were saying was complementary to each other. The other thing that it reminds me of is the really lost opportunity between Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes in Paris, where Hobbes is one of he really is the father of modern political philosophy more than, say, Machiavelli. And I would even argue, and I have argued this in a piece, that Hobbes deserves just as much as Descartes to be called one of the fathers of modern philosophy in terms of epistemology and metaphysics, just as much as Descartes does. And so you get these two really great minds. And Hobbes really wanted to engage Descartes. Descartes really was not into it at all. Hobbes gave one of the sets of objections in the Meditations, and that was it.
Yep.
Descartes was done with him after that point.
Yeah,
and so you see these lost opportunities. I mean, putting aside the examples, speaking a little bit more broadly, do you think that's something that's kind of endemic to the world of philosophy? We philosophers are not as rational as we ought to be.
Right, yeah, of all people. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's as much of a human tendency for philosophy types to fail to engage each other in an adequate and charitable way as other people who find themselves at odds. No, to your point, so I think it's human nature, I really do, and I think it's not all bad either. Like, I think what was interesting about the exchange between Santayana and Dewey, which is just a published exchange, but didn't go further. And Dewey wanted it to. I mean, Dewey wanted it to, and would have welcomed it going further. Santayana.
Do you think it's a temperamental thing?
Definitely. And Santayana, the unfortunate side to Santayana's personality, and I've always struggled with this in my otherwise just admiration of him, is he really was too aloof. He lived very aloof from the world. He never had kids. He never really had family. He never had a sense of connection to the world whatsoever. And it's kind of remarkable to me that he lived as long as he did and as happily as he did without any of that, just because it's kind of rare for a person to be so disconnected from the world and to yet be,
Well, that brings up another interesting point. I mean, we could think of complaints that could be made of other thinkers, like what could Thomas Aquinas or Anselm of Canterbury possibly have to tell us about love when they were, one was a prior, one was a monk. What would Epictetus possibly have to tell us about say management when he the most he ever did was run a school?
Right.
Do you think that not having had those experiences precludes you from being able to say intelligent things about them? I mean, we don't want to rule it out entirely, right?
No, and there's a wonderful discussion of this very thing in dialogue on Georges Santayana, which happened at the time of his death, and when colleagues, friends, acquaintances, and students all kind of gathered in a very informal setting and had a discussion. And they entertained this very question, and the question came up of, he was so aloof, and I wonder if Santayana wasn't just kind of sad, and there was speculation about him being a sad old person dying in Rome alone. Yeah. And there's absolute evidence to that effect. He was pretty lonely at the end of things. I visited his actual hotel room in the nun convent in Rome, which is very much intact. The balcony where his hotel room was, you could kind of see it. Yeah. And man, it's kind of small and humble and depressing.
And austere.
Yeah, and it was less austere than I thought. I was picturing something really like, I guess, fancy or something, but it's a hospital. He spent a good deal of the last part of his life getting his meals delivered to him, and then his bed, turned up or whatever, and taking walks around Rome, and he would only read what he could carry with him on his walks, and he would like tear out parts of books and walk with that part that he tore out, and he was very kind of like, he was very, he only wanted to take with him what he could hold in his hands, kind of guy. Anyway, he sounds to have lived, and he seems to have lived a rather solitary and at times probably lonely and sad life. But he was not unaware of this, and you see this in his letters. He's self-conscious, he's self-aware of this, and he reflects on it. And he's bittersweet about it. I think he takes a disillusioned attitude towards it ultimately.
Do you think there's something in the way he lived his life, and in perhaps the value that he placed upon that's similar to the solitude that other philosophers, or poets too, I have in mind particularly Rainer Maria Rilke, thought was necessary for us to develop fully as human beings. I mean, Rilke talks about solitude in almost metaphysical ways, that we need to deepen it within ourselves. We're not really capable of fully loving somebody until we've developed within our solitude and grown. Love is two solitudes protecting each other. And then Nietzsche talks about the need for solitude as well. sort of the Stoics.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and I think that's absolutely true. And maybe for that reason, Santayana's not necessarily to be pitied. Maybe after all, he was developing in himself a kind of a solitary ability to be at home with himself, perhaps to some degree. I mean, again, back to his homosexuality, about which he only alludes in one letter, and there's very little. There's no overt evidence of this except through relationships with the elder Russell.
Yeah.
So there's some interesting biographical stuff there. But Santayana never consummated, ultimately, as it were, his seeming homosexuality. And for that reason, he lived on the fringes of most of his relationships and was perfectly content to do that. I mean, to be fair to Santayana, too, on this point, he was incredibly sociable. Just because he lived a solitary life, he was a very cheerful person to go visit, and he was very welcoming, and he loved visitors, and he welcomed them all the time, and he talked all the time about. It seemed like a visitor was coming to his door every month, and he was spending loads of time traveling around with various of his associations, including his literary executor.
Well, I mean, do you think that not having a lot of connections then opens up the possibility to offer that kind of hospitality?
I think so, and I think he may have also compensated for what maybe you and I or others get from more intimate relations with a spouse and kids and so on. He may have compensated.
But you see something kind of similar in monastic life, where again hospitality, the rule of Saint Benedict, a lot of discussion of hospitality in there, and it's very important. But they live a life that's pretty regimented. It's prayer and work, and there's a lot of time by oneself, which some of it's supposed to be used for prayer, but doesn't always go that way. And in a sense, not having all those like family life and those connections opens up one's capacity to when the guest comes in to say, "Oh, hey, so good to see you."
Yeah. Absolutely, I think so. Santayana's famous quote about how the marriage bed and an academic position. I'm just paraphrasing, are like the death of being a philosopher, right? There's no way you can be married or be a professor.
Well, you're doubly screwed then, aren't you?
And he's right. And actually, I think there's some truth to this. I don't consider myself a philosopher by any means. I always correct people and say I'm a philosophy scholar and teacher.
Well, I consider you a philosopher.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Someday I'll maybe write it down more formally and have others be a good judge of that. But I mean, there's some truth to this. I think devoting yourself to the life of the mind and so on, it can be very difficult when you're raising kids and so on. But, it's an interesting discussion. John Locke, a famous scholar of Santayana, has some good things to say, some interesting things to say along these lines about contrasting Dewey and Santayana and how it was perhaps a blind spot in Santayana that he never had kind of family connections.
This matrix of connections.
Yeah. But it's interesting. He has a great phrase. He says Santayana looks at everything through reversed binoculars, and when he uses this.
What does he mean by that?
Yeah, he uses this phrase a lot. This is John Locke's, and when he first said this to me in conversation, I was like, I wonder what he meant. I said the same thing.
Yeah. And
then I encountered it in something he wrote and something else he wrote. So it's kind of a refrain. And what he means, I think, is from a distance, right? From a great distance. So whereas most of us we look out from where we are to try to get a kind of big picture sense of things. Santayana starts from the big picture and then has a hard time, zooms in. And he's good at it, but I think it keeps the world at bay to some degree, keeps the world at arm's length, and I think it probably kept people at arm's length. No question, Santayana was, if you wanted to psychoanalyze him, he certainly had some issues with political engagement. He was criticized for his aloofness in that regard. He was solicited at various times of his life to be politically engaged, and he never followed through on that. He was like very wary of that stuff. I mean, he lived in Mussolini's Italy and complimented the trains running on time like others did, and never really stressed too much about the threat of fascism, and which was scary because he lived right through these two world wars. He was scarily aloof from that stuff, and also we should mention anti-Semitic. I mean, he has many passages in his writings that unfortunately bear the mark of their time in terms of typical people like him who would have views. He had a couple of famous Jewish students, Walter Lippmann and Horace Callan. Okay. So, and I wrote about this recently, which is why it's on my mind.
Lippmann I know about, but I doubt any of the viewers know him. He was a political scientist, right?
Yep, and had a very public influence along the lines of John Dewey. John Dewey and Lippmann had a famous kind of series of debates about the Great Society, and so he was kind of a quasi elitist conservative, but not really a liberal elitist conservative.
Yeah, I mean, sort of what led into we could say they're the ones who led into like the Kennedy administration and gather all the great minds.
Their vocabulary, it's striking how much of Lippmann and Dewey's vocabulary ends up in political discourse in various ways, and Lippmann in particular. But he was influenced by Santayana, Lippmann, and Santayana always preferred Lippmann to Callan, Horace Callan.
Why?
Because of this is his anti-Semitism I'm referring to, so I've been working this out recently. It's interesting. He saw Lippmann as the good Jew, and he saw Callan as kind of like the bad Jew, or the troubled Jew or something. He read his student Callan. His student Horace Callan sent him letters and said, "Hey, kind of wanted his old teacher to read what he was writing," and he was writing about a Zionist kind of development. He was all for kind of the establishment eventually of a Jewish state in one of his writings, and he's speaking very openly about, and I think very deeply too. I think Callan had a great insight into the situation of the Jew in the first half of the 20th century. He had a brilliant insight into it. But Santayana criticized him. He uses all the stereotypical kinds of criticisms that people at that time who were anti-Semitic might use against Jews, and he did against him. But whereas Lippmann was sort of like he preferred Lippmann because Lippmann was, I guess, more like him or something. Or I couldn't quite say, but it's an interesting feature of the larger picture of the man Santayana for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something we talked about a little bit. I mean, Santayana is not part of the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, but he's also formed by it to some extent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I mean, he never relinquished his Spanish citizenship. He's buried, and I've seen it, in the Spanish plot in Rome, the only the Spanish territory of plots for the gravesites in Rome. We went on a rainy Halloween night in Rome searching for his grave, and it was too dark, and we couldn't find it. So the next morning we went and found it. It was a wonderful experience. And a very humble-looking thing. It's like a tiny little sort of memorial to Santayana, but he was buried there because he was in Rome ultimately. I think he wanted at one time to leave Rome for sure, but he became too old, and he was too established at the convent where he was being taken care of. But he never gave up his Spanish citizenship, partly because, I mean, I think obviously because he never felt like he
totally belonged.
Yeah, I mean, if he belonged anywhere, he was originally Spanish. He was a Spaniard, and there's certainly commonality. Speaking of which, between him and Unamuno, some of the listeners might know Miguel de Unamuno, who wrote The Tragic Sense of Life, and one of my favorite short stories of all time, San Manuel Bueno Martyr, which is it's terribly untranslated. There's one poorly translated version that you can Google if you want, but it's worth reading even poorly translated. It's a wonderful story, but it's very Santayana-like. And again, a very underdeveloped area of scholarship would be to compare and contrast Unamuno, the existentialist, with Santayana.
I mean, another Spanish philosopher that comes to mind is Ortega y Gasset. Are there connections between him and Santayana at all? Or?
Not that I could speak very astutely about, but there are, I think. Speaking of this very point, Spanish scholars I know of in association with the Santayana Society, which I'm proud to be associated with over the years, we've met for 3, maybe 4 international conferences now. I lose count because there's been enough of them. And there's a cohort of Spanish scholars who want to kind of take Santayana up in the generation of 98. And if listeners aren't familiar with that, that's a Spanish scholarship kind of category for Gasset and other figures who constitute this generation of 98, which is a flowering of intellectual Spanish genius kind of thing. That's my crude understanding of it. I'm not a scholar.
But they want to take him up as somebody who's
belongs
largely not writing in Spanish.
Exactly, and that's what's fascinating about it. So you have contemporary Spanish scholars.
It's sort of like Arendt, right? I mean, is it Arendt a German philosopher or an American philosopher?
Very similar,
right? Because once she gets here, she writes, I think, exclusively in English, right?
So it's problematic. Like Santayana himself would have been like generation of '98. What are you talking about? But
I'm not joining any club like that.
Yeah, but I find it promising and interesting. I think these fellows, these great scholars, and when you post this or wherever you post this or if you post this, I think we can provide all this information for interested persons. But this is an international development. There's a guy named Chris Skowronski who is the kind of the head of all of this. He is a Santayana scholar in Poland, from Poland, Opole University, and he has been the reason why all of these scholars have gotten together probably 5 times now. There's been, I don't know how many, I should know, but I know there's been probably at least 4 international congresses on the thought of Georges Santayana. So.
Well, that's a good segue into 2 things. One is, tell us more about the Santayana Society, and then the other thing is, where is he being read in particular and studied in particular?
He comes up in funny places, Santayana, scholarship-wise, and there's people from from literary critical studies, from people who are scholars and writers of poetry will show up, but historians are very interested in Santayana, and then of course philosophers. But when we gather with the Santayana Society, which has since the 80s has been meeting annually at the American Philosophical Association, the APA Eastern Division meeting. The Santayana Society has a standing session there since the 80s. When we gather there, it's amazing the people that show. One guy I know who became a PhD under our old mentor Tom Alexander at SIU. He's a retired Social Security guy and ended up going on to read all of Santayana's works and decided he wanted to get a PhD. I mean, this is the kind of person that we see coming out of the woodwork and all the time and coming from all kinds of corners of life. He's that kind of a figure, but the society is the only formal apparatus in which there's kind of like a collection of at least stateside scholarship that goes on.
And there's a journal, too. So
it's called Overheard in Seville, and it is the Bulletin of the Santayana Society. Now, the title of it is interesting because the Bulletin of the Santayana Society, right?
Yeah.
It's Angus Kerr Lawson, who has recently passed away, was the longtime curator, and he was the source of his origin of the actual bulletin. I think it was his intention to make sure it was only a bulletin. He didn't want this to be a rival of what's called the transactions, post-transactions. He didn't want this to be something that pretended to be rivaling anything that pretended to be like a pure, research one institution kind of journal. With that said, over the years, it's been almost the sole source of all of the scholarship of Santayana. It's been the place that's gathered. It's the publication that gathers most of the scholarship that happens on Santayana.
Yeah, sort of like Hobbes Studies or Hume Studies or these other journals.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, but the Bulletin, Overheard in Seville, which is now, so I was privileged to be president after Glenn Tiller was president, who was president after Angus Kerr Lawson, who passed away not 5 years ago. And so Glenn Tiller, then me, and now it is Richard Rubin. And so we're taking turns, we 7 or so American scholars who spend our time devoting ourselves to the study and discussion of Santayana's thinking. I should mention Herman Camp for sure. Herman Camp is now retired. He was recently a president of a small college in New Jersey, and he retired from that. But for years, he was John Locke's student, and he was the reason why the critical edition, which is now at IUPUI under Martin Coleman, he was the reason why that got underway and eventually developed to where it is. William Holtzberger recently died as well, but he was the colleague of Camp, and those are the 2 main editors still of the names that are on the side of the volumes of what are called the critical editions of Santayana's works. Those are huge, of huge importance because, well, they're critical editions, which if listeners don't know about those are really vital to scholarship. They kind of certify and give you everything you need to know about the history of a particular work that an author wrote.
Usually heavily footnoted and
emendations and everything. So that work is ongoing, and it's at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. You have to say that very carefully, otherwise you get it wrong. So a conglomerate. It's at what's called the American Institute I might have that wrong, but it's the name. It's the namesake of a collection of three major figures. Who is it that's under this? This is Frederick Douglass, the Frederick Douglass papers.
Could be, yeah.
C.S. Peirce is also there, and then Santayana, and I think I might be leaving one out. But it's under this American Institute that Santayana Society, or Santayana Edition, don't get that mixed up, Santayana Edition is connected with that at IUPUI. Meantime, the Santayana Society is a separate for
But
tax
supporting,
purposes.
you could say.
But they support each
Yeah.
other. Yeah, they're connected. So, yeah. I hope that was somewhat
What
clear.
are the prospects, you think, for both younger scholars, studying Santayana? Is there a new generation? And then, broader appeal, people who aren't in academics, to get into Santayana?
Funny you should ask. That's exactly on the minds of the current sort of society folks, of which I'm associated, of course. We recently had several email exchanges where we're coming up with all kinds of good ideas to try to solicit younger scholars' interest, more innovative, more social and political philosophy types to write on Santayana, which hasn't been the case in the past. So we have a variety of strategies. One of them is Angus Lawson. We're honoring him and his life's work with an award. It's a yearly award, $300. I hope I have that right, for the award of the best essay on Santayana. There's a deadline and so on. I hope we can provide all that information at the end of this. That'd be careful.
Yeah, actually,
nice.
we certainly can. And it sounds like a very small award, but this is the sort of thing that for like a budding scholar, you would go onto their CV, and it would be something that people would take note of.
Yep.
So I think
And
that's
the
important.
Angus Lawson Prize, we call it, and I think it's only on its third year. It's that recent, but there's that. There's SAP, the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, and APA are the two conferences that the Society kind of bounces between. It's always at the APA, but every 3 or 4 years.
Oh, it doesn't always meet at SAP?
No, SAP has a kind of a. We've tried to get it standing there, but they just can't accommodate because they have. There's Royce, there's all the other figure societies, and unless they accommodate every one of them, they can't. So that what they do instead is they kind of invite each in turn.
Okay.
And it's great that they do, and when they do, great things come of that. And we tried the Central APA for a while, but that wasn't as successful. It was very underattended, and I think these bigger conferences are starting to get more underattended as things happen in academia. But we're trying.
That's a topic we could talk about.
Well, related to this wonderful endeavor that you're doing, Greg.
You're talking about the modern Stoicism and Stoicism today?
Technology, getting connected with folks
stuff,
who are listening to this and via videoing. We are going to. This is Richard Rubin, who's now the president of. Did I just say Richard Rubin? Yes, I did.
Yes.
I'm getting that right. I'm really fuzzy brained right now. We are developing so we can do like some kind of webcast or something like that for one of the major conferences. And in fact, I'll give you the information. But the next, I think it's the first one. I may have missed another one, but I think it is the first official one. Is going to happen. In a couple months, I want to say, and I'll give you the information. But
there's so much potential for connecting people who can't make it to these central conferences via streaming, and it's really being under explored. This is one of my sort of soapbox issues because I'm involved with the modern Stoicism people, really great at that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Aristotelians, not so much. I've suggested to the International Society for MacIntyre and Inquiry, year after year after year, you need to start doing some connection because it's an international society for people who can't make it to France or can't make it to wherever you happen to be holding the thing. You should have some video sessions, right? Record some of the sessions and have the membership, log in and talk about what's going on and answer a few questions, and then host a few panels where it's actually being done by Skype. It'd be so easy to do, and you get so much either indifference or resistance from traditional academics about that. The people who get it, of course, are the people in business or in other fields. So,
and I also wonder how much I know the APA is not alone in this, but they've recently been somewhat in crisis. They've been sending a lot of emails about, support the APA. They're losing money, and they are for all the reasons that academia itself is under.
I'm not a member. The only time that I've ever paid membership dues is when I needed to go there to interview for conferences. And it was in large part because I saw the APA as embodying three things I didn't like. One was it was dominated by analytic philosophy. Yeah. The other thing, it was dominated by elitist institutions. And the third thing was that it endorsed all sorts of, political stances that some of which I could get behind, some of which I couldn't. And so I think a lot of academics see the APA just as a necessary evil that we had to put up with. Yeah. And so we've got kind of a bad taste in it. They are trying to retool. Yeah. Pretty dramatically.
I have some mixed feelings about myself. I feel like, on the one hand, I feel this guilty part of myself says, I definitely owe some loyalty to things like the APA or SAP, but I don't know.
SAP, I think you owe more to.
Yeah, perhaps.
I have no problem, sort of supporting these smaller, more local things. But when it comes to the APA, they would really have to be doing a lot for me to think that I owe them anything myself.
Well, and relative to the Santayana Society, it's one of the things going forward now that we're sort of moving to this new sort of era and phase of things. Do we want to continue to have those standing society meetings at the Eastern Forum? We've flirted with the idea of moving to the Central, but again, we've kind of struck out doing that. It would be ideal maybe to just do SAP, but again, we can't do that. So it's a tricky thing, it's really tricky.
Yeah. I mean, this may sound like a bit of an arcane topic for some of our viewers, but I think it's important to point out that a lot of philosophical exchange happens through two main means. One is through journals and the publications that go on in those, but a lot of it happens through conferences. I know when I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, because I was the only person other than one other guy part-time doing philosophy at the prison, conferences were a lifeline for me. I would go. I mean, you're in a small department here where you have some good colleagues in other areas, but you only have one other full-time philosopher, right? Mm-hmm. So conferences are a way where we academics can exchange ideas, can find out what's going on, propose collaborations. Those are very important for academic life.
Yeah, and I feel bad when I miss one full year. I don't think I've gone a full year recently, but if I ever have to miss a conference, I feel like I'm kind of I'm out of connection, and I like to get that connection, and it's vital, I think, to the furtherance of what we're doing. I mean, Santayana is an example of a figure that I consider him readable for centuries to come, and I think he's one of those great figures.
Yeah, so this goes back to the question of readership of Santayana outside of academia. What do you see the prospects?
It's already good, and I think that's one of the things that sustained, strangely, the Santayana interest over the years is that people from various outside of philosophy quarters are engaging with Santayana. And if you just peruse the last, say, 10 editions of the Bulletin, you would find people from an array of backgrounds. Classics, certainly, history, and critical theory or literary studies are certainly just a few examples.
Do you think he has something to say to people who aren't in academics at all, but might be, working in an office or are retired or from different walks of life?
I think so. It's difficult unless you have. You still have to have a broad interest in the history of philosophy. I suppose the catch with Santayana is that he is so steeped in the history of philosophy that it's very quick and easy to lose your foothold if you're not following his references and so on. But that said, no, I think he... there's a book called Dialogues in Limbo. Maybe that's I had in my mind when I misspoke earlier, but that is a wonderfully creative book. The book is nothing more than it's a recreated dialogue where he's working out his ideas, but in the guise of there's a stranger having a conversation with some of the great figures in the history of philosophy, and it's wonderful because it's written like a Platonic dialogue, and I think anybody can engage with it, and I think you'll find it. But really recommend one particular dialogue called Normal Madness. If you were going to read one of them, it would be called Normal Madness. It's a wonderful dialogue. Okay. Yeah.
That kind of reminds me, the notion of dialogues in limbo, of what it is that Socrates threatens he's going to do in the apology. You can kill me, but then I'm going to go down to Hades, and then you're not going to be able to shut me up, and nobody's going to stop my mouth, and I'm going to cross and examine all these great heroes that you've got, and just wait, you guys until you die and come down there.
You know what? It's very possible Santayana had that passage in mind when he came up with this concept. I'm not sure, but it's a very creative concept. I mean, Santayana was kind of, what I would say. There's this quip about Emerson, or rather about the James brothers. I should say the James brothers, Henry and William James. William James wrote philosophy like a literary figure, and Henry James wrote literature like a philosopher. To whatever extent that's true, Santayana, like Emerson, wrote philosophy in a literary way, and while that's off-putting to people who want,
straight philosophy, just give me the arguments.
Yeah. What is your argument? And what is that stuff? I mean, I had a teacher in my master's program who said there's no point in reading Plato or any of the historical figures because their arguments amount to 3x5 cards, and you can, he had that narrow of a view, and it's that view that it is.
And I don't think that's going to die anytime soon. In part because it's not as if analytic philosophy is going to go away. It's kind of lost its original projects and its back history, but it's become sort of the de facto. So I think for a lot of people that's what it is. And then the internet also does promote a whole cross section of people who are not doing analytic philosophy, but they are arguing and they are interpreting in an analytic way. They're like, what's the argument? What's the premises? And that's it. And these are people who are, sometimes that's all they've really had, and some people are, I think, temperamentally driven towards that. But they're missing out on so much more because the history of philosophy, throughout its history, is we both know, philosophy has been not a separate, isolated thing, but something that had connections with history, with religion, with literature, with all these other, even you mentioned architecture, all these other fields, and it benefits so much when that's the way philosophy is being done. It's messier, but I think that for the ordinary person, it's also much more interesting and much more attractive.
Yeah, I get students all the time who, when we read Plato or somebody like him, and it's not necessarily Plato, but somebody who writes in a non-traditional or an expected way, what they've come to expect philosophy to be, they're very surprised. They're like, wow, I didn't know philosophy could be like this. And that's the thing that people who are very narrow, that's the unfortunate aspect when you look at philosophy only in terms of argument. But your point is well placed. It's a sensibility. You said it earlier. The analytic sensibility and the continental so-called sensibility will always be there. Whatever we call it, it's kind of a divide, I suppose, in the human. It's
I tend to see history of philosophy as a sort of tertium quid between analytic and continental philosophy, or maybe with a bit more in common with continental philosophy. But if you're doing history of philosophy, like if you're studying, say, Plato, well, you read all of Plato. You don't just read a few texts, or you read at least as much as you can. That's why you maybe pick a figure who's a little bit more manageable. Harry Frankfurt, in one of his essays, said that the reason he became a Descartes scholar was because Descartes' corpus was small enough that he felt himself to be lazy, and that would be easy for him to read. So
it's entirely that's very honest.
It's true. But I think there's something there. It's not necessarily it's all about locating them in their historical place, and we don't do a sort of historical reductionism where we say, well, they're just a product of their times. But you get so much more. Let's return to Santayana. You get so much more out of understanding who Santayana is and what he's saying by knowing about the turn of the century America and what Europe was like at the time and the situation that he was formed in and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that because when I got my PhD in 2003, I was employed thereafter in 2004. I've spent really the remainder of the time in between my teaching duties and so on, kind of filling in the gaps of the period of time of philosophy that I profess to be an expert in, and part of that is reading all the literature in the background of it.
Wow. This is a great topic. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many, we call them nowadays, rabbit holes that open up. Like
Yeah.
everything you research, there's another conversation that you could follow out further. So how do you manage that?
It's very hard. You have to be reading all the time. I mean, my bedtime reading right now is Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, just because it's a book that I haven't read, and I passed the reference somewhere and thought, I better fill in that gap. And I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it, but it never ends because I mean, take the historical period that I'm interested in, which is roughly 1850 to 1950. It's just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. You're never going to complete your understanding of that period of time. But you find how ignorant you are the more you know, as they say, as the saying goes. And that's one of the things I've enjoyed about having a career in education, and anybody who is interested in it that's the attraction of it is you learn how important it is to be humble and to figure out how little you know, and then to remain hungry for knowing more. That's what I do. I think you shouldn't only read philosophy. You shouldn't only read literature either. I mean, people in literary studies who won't go near philosophy, won't go, and I that's not a good thing.
Well, when I was at SIU, we had a lot of connections between the philosophy graduate students. I don't know if this happened with the undergrads, but philosophy graduate students had a lot of connections with people in the English department, and also speech comm and a few other areas as well. And I remember being struck when I went to like dinner parties or just regular parties, and we'd have conversations, and they'd bring up authors, and it wasn't so much talking about philosophical authors. It was talking about literary authors. They wouldn't like us philosophers because it wasn't so much about argument; it was more about evidence. They'd put forth a proposal about this is what's going on in this piece right here, and it could be about a movie, or it could be about some work of literature, and then the philosophers would say things like, "Well, that's an interesting interpretation, but here's why I think it's not really supported, and here's an interpretation that maybe other things in the text would support." And their jaws would just drop, and you got the idea that we were showing bad manners there.
Right.
And if you just shut up and listen to them, what you'd hear instead was, here's an interpretation. Oh, that's really interesting. And have you thought about this and thought about this? And there would never be that sort of critical moment of, no, I think you're wrong about that. And that's important. I don't think it's only analytic philosophers who can do that.
Right.
I think there's something about the field of philosophy that does tend to promote that.
Critical positions, taking critical positions. Related to what you're saying, I have a colleague, various colleagues across campus, but one in particular comes to mind. He's in sociology, and one time he was making fun of somebody in, I think it was maybe psychology department. They were kind of quipping back and forth, good natured.
Sparring a little bit?
Yeah, and he said something like, well, what we do is, we do the same thing you do, only we do it with evidence. But I can't remember how he put it exactly.
Those are fighting words.
Yeah, exactly, like with evidence. I remember thinking, sociology. Then my prejudices came out when I heard that. So we all kind of, my view is I think all these disciplines are really great and important, and obviously they make their own unique contributions. But we all have our sort of biases, and I'm an interdisciplinary person. I feel like all these things are.
So this is a good place to bring things to a close, both in terms of Santayana and in terms of philosophy. I would say one of the big differences is that in the 20th century, philosophy kind of shrunk in terms of its scope. In analytic philosophy and also in continental philosophy. And then, of course, some people in history philosophy, they'll say, I'm just a specialist. I only look at Leibniz and his thought about this or that. Well, we'll have that at least. So I don't see that in some of the 20th century figures that I'm really interested in, like, say, Gabriel Marcel or Maurice Blondel. And they think that philosophy, in principle, extends to everything. But unlike, say, Hegel, who thinks that philosophy not only extends to everything, but can digest it and tell everybody else where they fit in, they think that philosophy has to do a lot of work to manage to adapt itself. So if philosophy wants to look at religion, it can't just preach down to religion. It has to actually take what religious claims are seriously, and this is what's wrong with so much of philosophy of religion. Do you think there's something like that, especially when we think about Santayana's later works,
Mm-hmm.
where he's doing that all this very deep metaphysical work that has a similar presupposition about the nature of philosophy to it, that philosophy is in principle about everything, and if it's not trying to talk about the totality, it's failing in some way as philosophy.
I think so, and that's in fact one of the sticking points between Santayana and Dewey was Santayana claimed Dewey didn't have a cosmology. That was the phrase he used. He has no cosmology, and maybe not the best term or phrase, and one that he didn't necessarily unpack correctly, but I took him to mean something along these lines, that Dewey didn't, there was no sense of the totality. There was no sense of, he wasn't seeing the office of philosophy as, as to tell us about the totality in some way. And I think that, I think Santayana is certainly to be counted among those in the history of philosophy who see philosophy as explaining everything. What good would it do if you didn't set out to basically explain everything? Now, that's putting it one way. Santayana never pretended to explain everything in that sense. And that very phrase suggests a kind of narrower thing than it should too. You mentioned scientism earlier, the idea that we can explain everything from the standpoint of science.
Yeah,
that's what I take scientism to be. Philosophers who set out to explain everything don't necessarily say I can only explain it from the standpoint of philosophy. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What they do is they say Heidegger's a good example of this. What is being? Right? I mean, that very question is, if it doesn't open up everything, then what else would it do? And is it a philosophical question? I take it to be, but maybe it's not only that. And so it's a tricky thing, isn't it? Like, I think the philosophers like Heidegger and Santayana, I see a lot of kinships between them in this regard, that they see, they think ontologically. They think it starts with being, and what is the question of the meaning of being, says Heidegger, right? And that would be, if everything else doesn't follow from that, then I'm not sure, then I'm not sure what we mean by that. It's philosophy is it ought to explain everything in that sense. I guess is what I'm trying to say. But
or at least take a stab at it.
Take a stab at it, and it's a better way of putting it. And there's a great phrase, C.S. Peirce talks about it in terms of a guess at the riddle, and I think philosophy is at its best when it's speculative. And the opening chapter to Whitehead's Process and Reality has always been influential on me. He has that, it's called Speculative Philosophy, and he has this beautiful commentary there on, speculation is vital, and it's meaning speculation for the sake of speculation. We don't necessarily have to know we're right. Speculation is absolutely vital, and maybe the only way we can get at what this riddle of existence is. And I love that sentiment, because that's what philosophy is when it's at its best. To me, it's most humble and it's least arrogant. So
well, it's great close for the conversation. Thanks very much for offering your expertise and experience.
Well, thank you, Greg. No, you're doing a great thing with these ongoing videos you're doing and tutorials. I think it's an amazing service to the layperson and beyond. So,
thanks.
Thank you, sir.